Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Phase 3 webinar on calculating holiday pay. The webinar will begin shortly, just so we can allow people a few more moments to attend. And for those of you who have just joined now, we're just giving people a few more minutes to gather their cups of tea and coffee. So we'll begin the webinar in about 30 seconds. Right, so I make the time just after 2 o'clock, so the webinar will now begin. So I would like to thank you for all joining us this afternoon on this Phase 3 webinar on calculating holiday entitlement and pay for part-year and irregular hours workers. We're delighted to see so many of you here because this situation, as you know, is ever changing. So my name is Louise Johnston. I am Head of Customer Success here at Phase 3, and I'm joined by David Boyd, one of our lead payroll consultants, and Ian Harpin, one of our payroll consultants as well. Hi, Ian. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, Louise.
Hi, Louise.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you.
Good to see you both. So, as I say, calculating holiday pay is an ever-changing situation, and it's, of course, a consultation as well. So what I wanted to make clear straight away is that the advice and guidance that we are giving you today is based on this exact point in time. So today is the 31st of January, and I'm just aware that the webinar is being recorded. So if any of you are watching this on catch-up, do just be aware that this is relevant at this point in time and is based on our payroll knowledge. Phase 3 are people behind technology, and we run payrolls for many organisations across all different sectors. And we also help people through their HR, finance and payroll system journeys. So to that effect, we aren't legal experts, but we are hoping to shed some practical light and informed advice following the Harpur case. But it could, of course, change as time goes on and case law, of course, presents itself. So last year, as many of you know, the Supreme Court handed down its judgment on the Harpur Trust versus Brazel case. This was around the calculation of holiday pay and entitlement of a permanent part-time worker on a 0 hours contract. The judgment held that the correct interpretation of the Working Time Regulations 1998 is that for part-year workers, their holiday should not be prorated so that it's proportionate to the amount of work they actually perform each year. It's actually relevant to a reference period which determines their average weekly pay, which ignores any weeks in which they didn't work. As a result of this judgment, part-year workers are now entitled to a larger holiday entitlement than part-time workers who work the same total number of hours across the year. And this has created a really difficult role for payroll professionals. So over the next hour, we're going to cover a few things to help you with some more practical advice. We're going to get to grips with the 5.6 weeks holiday entitlement. We're going to look at all different types of workers that might happen across your organisation. We'll go through the dangers and pitfalls of paying employees for unused leave. We'll look at the principles of the 52-week rolling average calculation. We're going to see whether or not we can still use the 12.07 calculation. We'll look at pro rata leave for starters and leavers, and also rolled up holiday pay. There's also time for a short Q&A session at the end. So you should see on Zoom that you've got a Q&A box. If you'd like to pop any questions on there, we'll do our best to answer any questions that you may have. So on that note, let's get straight on with the agenda, and I'll welcome again Ian and David. And the first thing that I would like some help with, please, guys, is getting to grips with the 5.6 weeks entitlement. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in this section, I'm just going to talk about some of the key points about the 5.6 weeks entitlement, some of the main concepts to highlight, um, just to clarify some of those, and um, just highlight a couple of things that perhaps people might not be aware of or might cause a bit of confusion, just so we can have, hopefully a bit of a solid foundation to go through for the rest of the webinar. After that, I'll go through a few examples of different kinds of workers so we can see, hopefully, how the 5.6 weeks holiday pay entitlement works out in practice, when you actually have to then apply it to different kind of working patterns. In practice, usually you have to convert it into hours and days so people can take part week leave, because it's very rare that someone just takes a full week's leave and that's all they ever take. So talking about the 5.6 weeks entitlement then. So the first thing I think to highlight is the fact that almost all workers are entitled to 5.6 weeks holiday entitlement. There are some caveats, there are some exceptions, but most workers and employees are entitled to it. However, I will just say, I think it's important for employers to actually bear in mind that employment status can be quite a complicated topic. It's quite a complicated thing to work out sometimes with exactly what someone's individual status is. So that's why I'd certainly recommend that before employers start looking at exactly who's entitled to a certain amount of holiday pay and processing that, they should actually then sit down and look at all the groups of individuals they have working and make a determination as to whether they are workers or employees, or perhaps whether they are would be considered self-employed or a contractor, because that does get quite complicated, especially these days when you have lots of employees, or I should say lots of individuals employed in the gig economy doing short contracts. So that's something I think I'd urge all employers to bear in mind, is that should be your starting point, is looking at all the individuals you're considering paying holiday pay for and giving holiday leave entitlement, and making sure you've got people categorized correctly. But presuming you do, they will then, and you've determined all the individuals you have working, that they are workers or employees, so they are entitled to that holiday leave from work. They are then entitled to 5.6 weeks. And I should just stress, actually, this section will focus primarily on the leave entitlement bit. Later on, we'll be talking about actual holiday pay. I think it is actually important to bear in mind there is a distinction between the two. Sometimes when we're talking about this topic, it's very easy to get a bit confused and start using different terms interchangeably and getting the two things mixed up. I mean, they are intrinsically linked, obviously, but they are separate concepts. So it certainly helps me when thinking about it. Think about leave first, entitlement to actually time off from work, and then the pay bit separately. So looking at the 5.6 weeks then, so what are people entitled to? Well, they're entitled to, say, this 5.6 weeks under the Working Time Directive 1998, and a lot of the terminology you'll see in there gives us a model, a typical full-time worker, someone who works 5 days a week and works days of fixed length. So that's the kind of starting point. That's the reference model, if you like. So I think it's helpful for people to have that in mind, because the legislation does actually cap the 5.6 weeks entitlement in terms of number of days at 28 days, which is based on that full-time worker model. So that's the first thing to say, is when you're converting your weeks into days and hours, which you'll almost certainly have to do for most for most category employees, when you're actually looking at giving them a leave entitlement, booking it, and then maintaining the balance, it's very rare that you're only going around to take it in 4 weeks. So when you're converting it into the number of days, so they can take individual days, it's worth bearing in mind that is actually capped at 28. So, for example, someone who might work 6 days a week, you couldn't then do six times 5.6 weeks to give them that entitlement, because it would be above the 28 days. And the 28 days is derived by simply doing 5.6 weeks times 5 days gives you 28. So that's something to bear in mind. The next thing to consider is the fact that 5.6 weeks is actually broken down into two separate parts, two constituent parts. So you have what's called, or generally known as Regulation 13 leave, which unsurprisingly is derived from Regulation 13. And that's derived from EU law generally, and that's the bit that's kind of been subject to the most kind of case law and most kind of examination about what types of pay you can actually pay for leave. Usually, I think when you see something in the news whereby there's been a story about it's now required that different kinds of pay over and above basic, things like regular overtime and commission, now needs to be included in holiday pay. That's generally what it's talking about, is those first 4 weeks of leave. The second bit, which is the 1.6, is derived from UK law. And they get to 1.6 by simply doing the 8 bank holidays, which we usually have in the UK, times 1.6 weeks. Times 5 days gives you 1.6 weeks. That bit you can treat a bit differently for pay purposes. So there's no requirement for employers to actually consider anything above basic pay for that little bit. So there is an option there for employers to actually pay, you have to pay the additional enhanced pay bits, which we'll talk about later on for the first 4 weeks. But the 1.6 weeks after that, you can pay basic if you so wish. One thing I will stress, though, is that does obviously create additional requirements for the employer to then maintain different balances of leave and work out a strategy. Well, how are you going to process that? So are you going to say, well, the first 4 weeks someone books, they can have it all and pay the enhanced pay with it? The remainder bit, when they take leave, pay basic? Or are you going to run them concurrently? Are you going to say every time someone takes leave, a certain proportion of that period they've taken at that point will be paid enhanced rate, the rest will be paid basic? So how are you going to do that? So you have options, but it does create a kind of a bit of an extra admin overhead, if you like. So that's something I just wanted to highlight there. Is there are, within this 5.6 weeks, there are different bits of leave, different constituent components, and they can be treated differently for different purposes. And the final bit just in this section, and I'm just going to something just to highlight, is around bank holidays. I come across quite often, and probably lots of people who work in the sector have come across this quite often, is the kind of misunderstanding of bank holidays. There seems to be this understanding that people are entitled to bank holidays as leave. So basically, you're entitled to bank holiday as paid leave from work. It's not quite that straightforward. So there is no actual legal entitlement to have the bank holiday away from work. What you have been entitled to, and this is kind of built into the 5.6 weeks, is you have the right to that equivalent time off, if that makes sense. And that's kind of works out, that's derived from the 1.6 weeks, that's derived from UK law. So that's the bit that usually covers bank holidays. So if you have an employee who works 5 days a week, and they work days of fixed length, and they work for an employer who doesn't require them to work bank holidays, business is closed on bank holidays, then naturally they're going to have those days off anyway. But if you have someone, say, works part-time and you pro-rated their leave down to take account of that, so if they work Monday to Thursday, say, and they don't normally work a Friday, and a bank holiday falls on a Friday, they don't actually have the right to that particular day off from work. What they have the right to is the equivalent leave to use elsewhere, obviously prorated to their hours. So that's just something I think is to bear in mind, because I've known personally throughout my career that has become a real sticking point in terms of explaining it to employees and getting people to understand it. So it's something to bear in mind and have a set policy about that and have it written out so employees can understand it. So that's the 5.6 weeks time. I think those are the key points. So how does this work in practice? Well, looking at different kinds of workers, then the easiest one to deal with is someone, as I've already sort of hinted at, discussed, is someone who works 5 days a week, and they work days of fixed length. So they're simply entitled to 28 days leave if you're pro-ratering it. Sorry, if you're converting it to days, I should say, or the equivalent hours, which is 5.6 weeks times 5 days gives you 28. So that's very simple. But I think it's useful to have that model in mind when you're then looking at other workers, because it gives you a reference point. The next type of worker is probably, the next easiest to deal with, I'd say, is someone who works a fixed period, fixed days and fixed lengths of days, but is less than a full timer. So someone, a classic example here would be someone who works 4 days a week, Monday to Thursday, for example. There, you need to convert their weeks into another unit to use, days or hours. So, and it's quite easy to convert to days. So you simply do 4 days, so their working pattern times 5.6 gives you 22.4 days. Obviously, bearing in mind, as I've said, they don't have the right to bank holidays off. They have the right to the equivalent leave, if that makes sense. And there it's perfectly acceptable to hold entitlement days or hours for your purposes. Moving on, then the next kind of most common, I think, scenario, and probably a bit more difficult to deal with, is employees who work compressed hours. So this is becoming more prevalent as employees now have the right to request a flexible working arrangement, and that can vary almost infinitely, I suppose. And as long as the employer can handle it from a business point of view, employees can request that and can work that. So there you've got an option basically to then convert from weeks down into hours, and that's kind of considered best practice. There is nothing in legislation that I'm certainly aware of that basically says you have to do a certain calculation. There's no prescribed method, if that makes sense. But it is, it's best practice to convert their holiday entitlement from weeks down into hours, and it certainly makes it easier to actually deal with. So there you would basically do a kind of two-step calculation. So first of all, you're going to look at so basically the formula there, the most useful one, is your annual entitlement, which is 5.6 weeks, times your average working day in hours. And the average working day is basically calculated by taking hours worked per week divided by your days working in a week. So if you did 4 days times 5.6 weeks gives you 22.4 days. And then if you've done a calculation, say the average working day is 6.75 hours across a week. So you then do 22.4 days times 6.75 gives you 151.2 hours. That's your entitlement hours for the year. And that, I think, is the kind of the fairest way to do it. Certainly I think it's the best practice. Then after that, you could, I think it's the next most prevalent sort of working pattern, certainly I come across, is people who work shift patterns. There, the kind of best practice guidance is to look at an average shifts per week times annual weekly entitlement. So a simple example would be someone who works, say, 4 shifts over 8 days. You would do 4 over 8 times 7 gives you 3.5 days. So basically taking the proportion of the working shifts as a proportion of the total pattern, times it by 7 to then convert that into a week. So that gives you an average of 3.5 days per week. And then you do 3.5 days times your 5.6 weeks entitlement gives you 19.6 days. So that's a kind of a good strategy for converting annual leave entitlement for shift workers. It does get a bit more complicated, I think, with people who work shifts of varying lengths. There, the best practice guidance is to perhaps, if you can, look at their shift pattern, and if it does fit the model of, say, someone who works compressed hours, if it's quite similar, convert your annual leave entitlement to hours is probably the easiest thing to manage there. And then the final kind of worker I'm going to talk about, which is probably the reason many people have actually maybe joined this webinar today, is actually casual workers, flexible workers. So by that I mean, people who are paid by the hour in terms of number of hours worked, where they don't have a fixed working pattern. And that's obviously becoming much more prevalent these days with people on 0 hours contracts or other kind of flexible arrangements, where they work just varying number of hours, and they're just paid according to the number of hours they work by reference to maybe an hourly or another unit rate. There, unfortunately, the bad news is we are on a bit more shaky ground. There is, at current time, obviously we said, this is being recorded on 31st January. So at current time, there isn't anything set out in law how to convert your weekly entitlement of 5.6 weeks into a days or hours basis, which would be the most appropriate way to actually treat annual leave entitlement for those employees. There's nothing set out in law. So the best guidance for that is to actually, absent that method, is to hold their leave entitlement in weeks. So keep it on that basis, but then have an agreed upon method when you're actually considering employees taking leave, so time away from work, and then paying them accordingly. That first of all is agreed upon, is consistent and works across your organization. Employees understand it, all different stakeholders understand it, and that actually fits with your systems and your processes. So I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that. So what you could do, for example, is if you've got employees who are required to book hours, working on a rota basis, so that you have a roster you define for a certain period and maybe a certain period in advance. Employees are rostered onto that, and then if they want to take leave, they can do so. That would be a way to basically calculate your entitlement for them. So because basically the idea, what you're trying to achieve is what does a week look like? Because that's the main difference with casual employees as opposed to people with fixed working patterns. Someone who works 5 days a week or 4, 3, whatever it is, obviously what a week looks like for them, you can work it out. Whereas for someone who's on a casual contract, you can't work it out. You don't know ahead of time what it actually looks like. So if you have employees who are on rota for a certain week and they're working 2, 3, 4 days, whatever that you rotated on, you could then take that as the basis for your that's a week's work. So if they want to take half of that off, what they've actually taken in terms of leave, it's half a week, and then you can book that against their 5.6 weeks. Another method you might use, if that's not feasible, is to use a fixed or agreed reference period. So every time someone wants to take leave, are you looking at maybe like the last 52 weeks to look at, to calculate what they've actually worked on average in a week. That then forms the basis of a week to say, whatever proportion of a week they want to take as leave, whether it's half a week, 2 weeks, whatever, that gives you a basis for the calculation. So you have options like that. That's the thing you need to think about. Unfortunately, as I say, there's no real prescribed method that the government's given us, and that's precisely one of the reasons they've actually come up with a consultation, which we'll be talking about through this webinar. They are consulting on this at the moment, and they are obviously there's lots of things that have come up as to why they've done that. One of them being the Harpur ruling, but the other one is the fact that there is no fixed reference period to calculate leave entitlement for casual workers, what a week looks like. So they are looking to do that, and that's something that hopefully we'll get some movement on. But the final thought on just this point is, whatever method you're using to calculate what a week looks like for casual workers, the most important thing to look at, and the most important thing I find, is you need to think about data quality and the systems you have in place to actually calculate it. It's the single biggest headache, single biggest factor that I think makes those kind of processes difficult to deal with and often creates pain and makes them fall down a long time, is the fact that data is not right, it's not in the right place, it's not cleaned, it's not accurate, it doesn't allow you to do calcs on it, and it's difficult to administer. So I say that's really important to look at. Okay, thank you. That's my little bit.
Thanks, Ian. That was really, really helpful. And something that I've picked up on there is obviously people working compressed hours and with the
Yeah.
right to request flexible working. And I think so many people have actually changed their working hours through recent times with COVID, etc. So you mentioned that it would be worthwhile converting annual leave into hours, but traditionally a lot of people are, of course, not used to this. So across the organisations that you work with, how many do you actually see starting to convert leave into hours? Out of
Um,
interest.
to be honest, it's a mixed bag. A lot of them are doing it, but I'd say probably an equal number are struggling to get to grips with it. And I think that is not necessarily maybe down to, well, it's a mixture, I suppose. Sometimes it's a mixture of organisations not really understanding it, but also not having the systems in place. If you have a software provider that's really taken this on board, then they will hopefully more often than not allow you to keep that leave in their system in hours, and that's really, that's definitely preferable. That's best practice and advice, guidance there. I say, to be honest, it is a bit of a mixed bag. I think it's becoming more something that employees are having to deal with and will have to deal with, because employees are going to start requesting that flexible working, and it just makes it so much easier to keep it in hours. And also it makes it easier for you to deal with as an employer in terms of employee relations. You have someone who works, maybe a couple of full days a week. By that I mean sort of 7-8 hours a day, but they have a couple of days where they do a shorter day. If they then come to you and say, I want that day off as annual leave, if you're not keeping the leave entitlement in hours, keeping it in days, if they have a Monday to Friday off, and Monday's a full day, Friday's half day, or shorter day, put it that way. Both, if you're keeping it in days, both of those days count against their leave entitlement. They've booked it and it comes off their balance, but they actually don't, they're actually having less time off work in terms of their physical work time at work usually. So that, I've known that creates sort of employee relations issues. People start complaining about it and it creates a bit of a headache for employers. So if you have a software provider that will allow you to keep it in hours, or if you have a team in place that can handle that and they've got a process they can put in place to do that, I'd certainly recommend it, because it's definitely worthwhile, I think.
And a lot of this does come down to the tech, of course.
It does, yes. I mean, as I say in the last point, the biggest issue I think I find with employers is just being able for them to be able to get the data into the right format, to clean it, to keep it in the right format, to have good data governance processes around it, to actually allow them to do accurate calcs on it, and have assurance that data is going to give them what they need, and then being able to have processes in place that allow them to administer that without too much of an admin overhead. If you've got to do retrospective calcs, say on how painful is that for you? So that
can of worms.
Yes, it is a big factor, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ian. That's really, really helpful. So next on the agenda is looking at the dangers and pitfalls of paying employees for unused leave. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Louise, and hello, everyone. So unpaid leave and the pitfalls that may occur. So when it comes to holiday management and the risk of excess leave build-up, prevention is better than cure. Adequate holiday planning minimises the risk of too many employees wishing to take leave concurrently, or certain employees building up excessive accrued leave. Now, I'm sure all of your organisations are managing leave effectively. However, I will now take you through some common situations that can arise. So the buying out of annual leave. Employers may be tempted to offer cash alternatives in return for giving up annual leave, which could due to staff shortages, large upcoming projects, or to tackle a buildup of unused accrued leave across the workforce. It is unlawful to pay employees in lieu of their minimum statutory leave, except on the likes of termination of employment. You then have unused leave, so not encouraging employees to take their annual leave and allowing employees to accrue too much holiday and not spread out their holiday over the year can be a major issue for employers. Line managers should regularly review, and we recommend quarterly, the annual leave balances and remind employees to take their annual leave so that the balance is taken by the end of the year. You also have the issue where you could be allowing employees to carry over excessive amounts. And the general rule is that you should ensure that employees are taking the minimum statutory leave as per the EU Working Time Directive. Otherwise, it will be lost. So if line managers are undertaking the reviews on a regular basis, the risk of this is minimised, and the exceptions being unable to do so due to an individual being on statutory leave. Now, employees may be entitled to carry leave over, but this is all very much dependent on the terms and conditions of the employment contracts and the company policies. You also have allowing too many employees to potentially take leave at the same time. And one of the biggest pitfalls is the impact on the business of allowing too many employees to take time off during particular periods, especially during the likes of the summer holidays or Christmas time. Line managers can sometimes be reluctant to reject the holiday requests, but they should be reminded that employers are not obliged to agree to an employee's request, and there should be a clear policy on holiday requests so that this does not cause the business any difficulties. It may be possible to have employees to agree to arrange staggered leave between themselves, so this encourages fairness across the board. So effectively, regular communications with employees based on what we have just discussed is always recommended. So that's it on that subject. So I will now pass you back to Louise.
Thanks for that, David. I mean, it just goes back to the classic example that really is up to line managers to make sure that they keep on top of this sort of thing. And it's interesting, as always, to hear that employers aren't obliged to accept annual leave requests. So it's imperative that we keep on top of this as the year goes on. Annual leave shouldn't be something that people panic about and then just book at the end of the year or save up for certain periods in time. As you say, it needs to be planned and managed accordingly. So thank you very much, David. So now moving on to the principles in the calculation of the rolling 52-week average. This comes back to you, Ian, and I can see just in some of the Q&A that people are asking about sort of on-screen visuals. Now here on Zoom, we can't actually do that for you. So I've got my pen and paper ready to start noting down all of this. And then again, because people are asking on the chat, if you want to get in touch with us afterwards about any specific occurrences for your organisation, because this covers such a broad range, if you contact us afterwards, we'll give you all of our details so then we can give informed advice specific to your organisation, if that makes sense. But in the meantime, Ian's going to talk us through the principles of the calculation, and pens and paper at the ready. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you. Yes. I'll try to give people some actual practical examples without making it too dry or boring. So let's see if I'm successful or not.
You might have to shout at us as well a bit.
Right. Okie dokie. Right.
Thank you.
So just to recap then, when you're thinking about the 52-week average for holiday pay, this bit is, by the way, it is mainly about pay. So we've always talked about the leave entitlement. This is where employees are actually now booking leave. They want time away from work. They want to be paid for it. So what do you pay them? And just to recap, regards to the 5.6 weeks, just bear in mind there is that 4 weeks, the first 4 weeks, which is derived from EU law, which is where you need to consider if they have any additional payments, and also bear in mind in this section, obviously we're talking about the holiday pay, and we've got a 52-week period. Here we are kind of a bit more firmer ground as opposed to the leave entitlement. This is for casual workers, where we are having to sort of make it up a little bit more. So here in this, when we're talking about the 52-week holiday pay entitlement, we are on a bit more firmer ground, because this is it's defined in law to a greater degree, and there are also some best practices. So the 52-week calculation, the basic principles are set out in the Working Time Directive, and also they're derived from the Employment Rights Act 1996, section 221 to 224, if people are interested. So this calculation is primarily going to be something employers are going to have to do if they've got employees who work hours where the number of hours vary, or their pay varies. So if you've got someone who is again works a fixed pattern, standard sort of full-time week full-time week, say, and they work days of fixed length, so they get paid the same amount every period, then you don't really have to do this calculation. It's going to be quite simple for you. Whenever they book leave, you can just pay them what they would normally be paid. Where this 52-week average pay calculation comes in is where you have employees who, as I say, either get paid varying amounts or they work varying hours. So this is where you're going to, or a combination of the two. So this is where you're going to have to do that calculation. And a classic example there is someone, it might be employed to do a certain basic number of hours and get paid a basic wage or salary for it, but then they do extra hours, they do extra overtime, they have extra elements like commission or bonuses, which are paid regularly. There you're going to have to use to use your pay history, look at your history, what the amounts you've actually paid people over a certain retrospective period to actually calculate that. And the basic idea is you're looking to establish when someone did work and what did they get paid for that, to establish an average weekly rate of pay. So obviously we know that holiday leave entitlement is set in weeks, so that's a set unit that's given in. So what you're trying to do with this 52-week calculation is achieve a figure, calculate a figure which gives you an average weekly rate of pay to use alongside that entitlement, if that makes sense. So the basic idea is to look at when someone actually wants to take leave. So the first thing to do is to establish a date that the employee is taking leave from or wants to be paid from, if they're a casual worker or someone with flexible hours. Then establish a 52-week retrospective reference period just prior to that leave, and then look at all the pay that someone's received in that period, and then look at all the hours or days, if you're doing it that they've worked during that period, to then establish an average amount of pay. So just get into the technicalities of it then. So there are some, when we're talking about weeks here, when we're talking about reference periods and things like that, there are some things that are actually defined for us in the legislation that we need to pay attention to. So the Employment Rights Act 1996 does actually define a holiday reference period as ending the last whole week on or before the first day of leave. And a week is actually defined for us as beginning on a Sunday and ending on a Saturday. So, for example, here we are on a Tuesday, 31st January. If I wanted to take leave starting today and I'm paid by reference to a variable amount of pay, my holiday reference period is going to end on Saturday, the 28th of January, and begin on Sunday, the 22nd of January. That's the last full week before I'm taking leave. So that's the first kind of thing you want to do. You need to establish that. And then afterwards, you're basically going backwards until you've achieved 52 weeks of pay. The caveat to what I've just said is if an employee is actually paid by reference to a weekly pay period, so they're paid, for example, midweek to midweek. So if that's their pay reference period and it breaks down into a week, you can use that. But if not, you should be using the Sunday to Saturday example I've just described. So once you've achieved that, you're then basically going backwards to achieve 52 weeks of pay. Now, just a few things to say about that. The 52 weeks of pay is a target, it's not a requirement. Now, what I mean by that is if you have an employee who has started with you quite recently or started, they haven't achieved 52 weeks of pay yet, so they've only started 3, 4, 5 months ago, and you only can go back so far to the start of employment, that's fine, you can use that. So if they've only had 20, 30, 40 weeks, you can use that. And if you basically don't have any given week, you don't have a period where employee actually did some work. So as you're going back through your weeks, your calendar weeks in succession, if you don't come across a week when an employee hasn't worked, you basically have to ignore that. You have to skip that week because you have to only include weeks where employee did work. And to accommodate that, the legislation does allow you to go back up to a maximum of 104. So effectively 2 years, if you like. So the basic principle is you go back from this, establish a reference point, keep going back 52 weeks. Any week where the employee did work, you can count that week. So you basically look at the hours they worked, so the pay they received, you'll get an average weekly pay. But if you come across a week where they didn't work, for example, if they were on statutory leave, or you just didn't offer them any hours, it's a casual contract, no hours were worked, you should ignore that and keep going back. And if you get to that 104 weeks and you haven't quite achieved 52, if an employee hasn't actually worked that many weeks, that's fine. As long as you've gone back that far and you've got the maximum number of weeks you can use that. So those are kind of the basic principles. And the concept for weekly pay is used in legislation, and it's kind of the fixed unit to work with because it doesn't vary in length. That's why it's in there. So that's why we need to work with it. Unlike months or years, it doesn't vary in length. And it's particularly important, therefore, for employees who have work on with no fixed hours. These are casual 0 hours employees. So how do we actually use this? Once we've got our reference period and we've started looking at pay, how do we actually do that? Well, I suppose most employees, well, certainly most employers I work with are going to have employees who are paid monthly. And I'm going to give some examples here of a monthly paid employee because I think it's the most difficult to work with. It can be the most complex. It's probably the best one to look at. So here you've kind of what you need to achieve is kind of a two-step process. So if employees are paid monthly by reference to, say, a monthly reference period, the guidance or best practice is first of all to work out an average hourly rate for that month. So here you're basically looking at total number of hours in that month, and you get the total pay. Divide your total pay by total hours to achieve an average hourly rate for that month. So for example, if you had someone who works, I've just got some random figures here. So if you've got someone who earned £1,850 in a month and they worked 170 hours, and this may include basic as well as overtime and any other elements they've worked, that comes out to £10.88. So for that, say that's March, the following month in April, they earn 2,350 and they've done 190 hours. That comes out to an average of £12.37 for that month. So that's the kind of first step. You want to, for each month that would be implicated in your 52-week period, or however far you're going back, get all those months, look at the pay they've got for those months and the hours they've worked. So this is pay for those hours worked in that period. So that gives you your hourly rates. Your average hourly rates, I should say. And then second part of the process is to, for each week you're looking at, assuming you're using a standard 52 weeks, so you have 52 weeks. For each week, you want to look at the day, each day for that week, and look at the month it falls into. So then you can then go away, grab the average hourly rate that's implied for that day, look at the number of hours you've worked, and then multiply one by the other, and then keep basically a sum of that. So at the end of the period, end of that calculation, you could sum the total for a week. So if someone's worked 20 hours at £10.88, gives you 217.60, and then 20 hours, let's say £12.37, gives you 247.40. So the total there is going to be 465 for that week. I think that's an important thing to emphasize, because you can have obviously weeks that will straddle different months. So if you have a week which is first few days of 1 month, the last few days go over into another month, you have to actually do this calculation to break it down into days, so you can actually get the right average hourly rate for that day. And then you can then sum all those up, and you've got your average for the week. And you're kind of doing a similar thing for each week backwards, basically. So once you've then summed all those up, so say your total came to just, for example, 19,500 divided by 52. So you have 52 weeks, excuse me, gives you £375. So that then becomes your average pay for for your holiday period. Excuse me, hang on 1 second. So that comes out £375 average. So that's then your average weekly pay for your holiday. So if someone says to you then, I want to take a week's leave, you pay them £375 the average. If it's half that, you pay them half of that, and so on and so on. So that's the basic principle. Obviously, it does get a lot more complicated than that depending on different scenarios. What I've just described won't cover every single scenario, but it gives you a gist of kind of the basic process. It might be applicable to another process to simply sum all the pay you've got in that period and look at all the hours. And if you want to keep your annual leave entitlement in hours, or you pay it out in hours, you can simply then divide 1 by 1 to give you an average hourly rate. And if someone takes 5, 6, 7 hours annual leave, you just multiply that by their average hourly rate. So there are different methods, different ways to do it, but it's the same basic idea to get to this average. Just so that's hopefully that gives people an idea of the kind of calculations they need to be doing. Just a couple of things to finish off on. So if you're doing this calculation for people who are salaried, obviously you need to think about how your payroll system works. If it's paying them a basic salary as default, you need to think about how you're going to do offsets. You also need to bear in mind what you're going to tell employees about how it works, because they will see their pay varying up and down. In the day, it's important to stress this kind of calculation will give you an average rate of pay. So if you get an employee, for example, who one period they take some leave, going back 52 weeks, you might take you into a period where they did a huge amount of overtime, for example, for some reason. That bumps the average hourly rate or the average pay rate up. If a couple of months later they take some more leave, and then obviously the 52-week average is always rolling, so that may actually the period where they did some high amount of overtime might drop off, and it reduces their rate. So that's one thing that employers often struggle to deal with, is getting those kind of questions from employees, because it's an average, it can vary, and it can get quite complicated. So that's something for employers to bear in mind. How are you going to actually communicate that? So thank you. Yep, that was my little spiel.
Thank you, Ian. And again, that is quite a quick whiz through of what is a very complex calculation. So again, for everybody that's joining us today, sorry, the sun's really in my eyes, lucky the sun's coming out. For anyone that isn't quite clear on that calculation, do feel free to contact us after the webinar. You can email us on info@phase3.co.uk, and we'll be more than willing to go through that calculation again to help you guys actually figure out what's going on here, because I do appreciate that it is quite complicated, and the aim of today is for us to sort of present to you our understanding as payroll professionals on the situation, rather than present specific advice. But again, if you do contact us on info@phase3.co.uk, we'll be able to help you. So moving on from calculations, what's the latest? Because I think it has changed a couple of times, David, on the 12.0% calculation for holiday. Can we use it or not?
Thank you, Louise. Well, this is now an interesting topic because for the majority of workers, that calculation method has now changed. So why was this calculation used? Well, the logic behind this was for each holiday year, a worker is entitled to the statutory minimum under the working time regulations. However, when calculating, you allow for the fact that those 5.6 weeks of the year will not be worked. So the 52 weeks less 5.6 weeks is 46.4 weeks. So then if you use 5.6 divided into those 46.4 times by 100, that gives you the 12.07%. And for the majority of employers, they tended to use this method because it gave a practical rule of thumb for them to follow when calculating holiday accruals for casual or variable hours staff. Even ACAS accepted this methodology. However, they have since withdrawn their acceptance of this due to legislative changes and the impacts it can also have with where employers are using that calculation to accrue holiday pay, which then leads me on to rolled up holiday pay. So there are still a lot of businesses that roll up holiday pay. So for every hour worked, you gain an additional sum, which is designed to compensate you in advance for your holidays. So in effect, you don't get any pay when you take holiday, as the argument is you've already been paid for it. So holiday pay should be paid for the time when annual leave is taken. An employer should not include an amount for holiday pay in the hourly rate. An employer should check if any current contract still includes rolled up pay, as these contracts will need to be reviewed and potentially amended. So there will be lots of ordinary employment situations where this is extremely relevant, and recognise the 12.07% calculation, and the use of that percentage calculation moving forwards is almost impossible. And you need to consider your own particular circumstances on its individual merits based on this information. Therefore, again, based on current rulings, you must give someone who works those irregular hours their full 5.6 weeks entitlement to be paid leave under the working time regs. And what you must do to calculate their pay for that leave is to look back over the previous 52 weeks prior to the leave period to average out what a week's pay is. And in most cases, when you do that calculation, the payment will be higher than the 12.07% calculation based on what they were earning previously. So there's some maths involved, but the 52-week averaging calculation is likely to give rise to an increased entitlement. So this is now where it makes some difficulty when you come to pro-ratering of mid-year holidays and with the recent changes that happened last year. So holiday years will differ and can be based on calendar year or may run in alignment with tax or academic years. And when an employee commences leave partway through the holiday year, this is fairly straightforward for a full-time or part-time employee who has a contract based on fixed hours across the full year. So for example, if the employee's holiday entitlement is 5.6 weeks per year, equating to 28 days leave, and commences 6 months into the holiday year, the employer simply takes those 28 days leave, divides it by 2 because the pro rata entitlement would be 14 days. Other employers may alternatively use an accrual system during their first year of entitlement so that the employee can only take as much leave as they have accrued at the time they take the leave. Now, the recent Harpur versus Brazel Supreme Court case impacted how holidays should be calculated for specific employees. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this, I'd just like to give a high-level summary of the case. So there was a visiting teacher, which Mrs. Brazel was working at the Harpur Trust with a permanent contract with no fixed minimum hours and was paid for work carried out. She usually taught between 10 to 15 hours per week during term time, and term time was normally between 32 and 35 weeks, depending on how the terms fell. Now, in this particular case, the Court of Appeal referred to Mrs. Brazel as a part-year worker. So even though she was working part-time effectively and didn't work a full week, it was for large parts of the year where she did not work at all. And that's what this case it was all about. It's the nature of the part-year position that's particularly relevant and not the part-time element. So she was paid a specific hourly rate. She submitted timesheets and was paid a month in arrears for the hours she worked in a particular month. And she was entitled to 5.6 weeks holiday to be taken. And under her contract, this was to be taken during school holidays. Now, how the Harpur Trust worked out her holiday entitlement was to divide that 5.6 weeks holiday across the 3 school terms. So initially she received 1.867 weeks, which is those 5.6 weeks divided by the 3 terms. So the holiday was made in April, August, and December. So the payment was at the end of the Easter, summer, and Christmas terms. And her pay was then calculated based on her average over the preceding 12 weeks, because that was the law at that time, now that we've changed to 52 weeks, in which she worked. Then, thinking that the trust was doing the right thing, they then read and used the ACAS guiding rules at that time for atypical workers. So then they changed the way they calculated holiday pay and used the calculation method based on a percentage, which was the 12.07% of the hours and pay she had received during the term. So let's discuss the basis of the percentage method calculation and compare against the calendar method for the particulars of this claim. Now, I just want to, I won't detail values of every step of the calculation. I will just give the end result values so you can see the clear difference between the two. So the percentage method took the 52 weeks. If you take off the 5.6 weeks of holiday entitlement, which gives 46.4 weeks, that 5.6 weeks is then divided by the weeks available to work, which is the 46.4 weeks, multiplied by 100, which gives the percentage of 12.07. So in the example of Mrs. Brazel, if she'd worked 127 hours over the spring term, and then you multiply by her hourly rate, and applying the percentage method of 12.07%, it gave a payment of £452.20 for holiday accrued over that one term. And that's the aspect that she complained about when they moved to that percentage calculation method, as it resulted in a reduction for her. And Mrs. Brazel asserted that she was entitled to holiday pay based on actual 5.6 weeks worked at her average rate of pay. So based on the calendar method, if she had worked 127 hours in a term, and in this particular reference period was the spring term, and it resulted in 10 weeks of work, and using the 12 weeks reference period, which was the relevant period of time at the point this was decided, so they then added in 2 weeks from the previous autumn term of 22.5 hours to make that 12-week reference period. So the total hours worked for the reference period was 149.5 hours. They then multiplied that by her hourly rate and then divided it by 12 months of the year. And then that value was multiplied by a holiday of 1.867 weeks, which is the 5.6 weeks divided by the 3 term times. That result ended in a value of £686.16. So a couple of £100 in the difference for one term. So after explaining that, I hope you are all still with me. So based on this, the Supreme Court ruling decided that the calendar method should be used, and holiday entitlement for part-year workers on permanent contracts should receive 5.6 weeks of annual leave with a day one right, so not accrued over time regardless, and that their holiday entitlement should be calculated using the 52-week holiday entitlement reference period, as that legislation changed from 12 to 52 weeks in 2020. So this is now causing a huge headache for a lot of organizations, especially with clients that I work with in the education sector. Now, this ruling doesn't set out how to convert this entitlement into days or hours for workers with irregular hours. And current government guidance suggests that employers may wish to calculate average days or hours worked each week based on a representative reference period. In all cases, employers must ensure that each worker receives at least 5.6 weeks annual leave per year. Now, term time workers who are not retained by their employer between periods of work, for example, they are paid by the hour, work as a supply or visiting teacher, or are working under a 0-hour contract with a permanent contract, are also legally entitled to a minimum of 5.6 weeks holiday a year. And this entitlement cannot be prorated on account of the weeks they are not required to work. Now, I must state that whilst term time workers are entitled to 5.6 weeks annual leave, this will not in practice necessarily equate to 28 days holiday. A worker's actual entitlement will be determined by their regular working pattern during the part of the year that they are required to work. So as an example, using the standard entitlements, if the person is contracted to work 4 days during those 39 weeks of term time, the calculation would be 5.6 weeks times by the 4 days that work equals to 22.4 days. Now, for workers who do not work fixed or regular hours and started partway through the leave year, their employer should use as many complete weeks of data they have. So for example, if a person has been with their employer for 30 complete weeks, that is what the employer should use, ignoring any weeks in which no remuneration was payable. Now, the one thing I'd like to highlight, and Ian touched on this previously, is that currently the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is in consultation to review the legislation to ensure part-year workers and workers with irregular hours to receive holiday entitlement and pay, which reflects hours they have worked, and pro rata holiday entitlement so that employees receive leave in proportion with the total annual hours they've worked. As I mentioned, this is being reviewed, so you still need to adhere to the recent changes. So, in a nutshell for organisations, this is also unleashing a huge headache where individuals can potentially make claims. Now, although the legislation change is not a retrospective decision, some businesses are making financial budget provisions as any employee who believes they have been underpaid and make a claim, and the conclusion is that they've been underpaid based on that 12.07% calculation, has the right to claim up to 2 years back pay on the underpayment made, and that's under the Deduction from Wages Limitation Regulations Act. And the claim for unpaid holiday pay must be brought within 3 months beginning with the date payment should have been made, and in most cases will be the relevant monthly payroll date. Now, employers should be proactive and they'll need to audit their pay data and contracts to check that the number of part-year workers who may be affected to work out the total number of underpayments that may have been made. Now, the one thing I'd like to discuss before I hand back to Louise, and I'd like to mention, is that there is no one size fits all, because different organisations have different contracts in place, may offer more than the statutory minimum. So as I said, there is no one size fits all. And I'm sure that many of you will have specific questions. So because you may also use a variety of different payroll systems with process specifics, and that going into detail with a handful of you will not be a good use of the limited time available. What we advise is you take the information we have given and you use that to review your current contracts and also take any necessary legal advice on how you apply and implement those changes, as we are not specialists in employment law. We would also recommend you liaise with your payroll software providers, along with payroll managed service providers such as Phase 3 for support on those technicalities. So as I said, if you have any further questions or want to discuss your own specific situations with Phase 3, please reach out to Louise. And where we may be able to support you with your specific situations, a further discussion can be arranged between us. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that, David. That was really, really useful and informative. Just a question from me. If people are starting, obviously, as this case law is coming forward, if employees are starting to query their annual leave entitlements or pay, is there a time limit that employers have to get back to people on these queries?
There is no specific time limit. I think what they need to do is review their pay data and their contracts of employment, and then they'll need to work back, because the key thing that's needed here is the history of that pay data. And believe it or not, some employers don't even document that on the likes of pay slips or have the ability to report on that in their systems. And I think there are still some organizations that use manual spreadsheets. Now, just to give you an example, and again, the headaches of working with clients in the education sector, I have a particular client where they do roll up the holiday pay because they thought that was the best approach. And this was based on visiting teachers who work, they have a permanent contract and they just have no fixed hours or minimum hours that they need to work in a week. And what happens is that the school, they actually assess the number of expected weekly lessons that they work, and they apply an equation to that, and they actually give them a stipend over the term time. And then at the end of that term time, timesheets are then submitted. They've used that for quite some time because that was what was implemented by the council of the school. And I think, again, with collegiates, universities and schools, there are still people using that methodology. So again, they have to pass it through council, then go into consultation, and then work with the likes of Phase 3, which is what we're doing to try and work out a process of where we can implement the change in their system.
Okay.
So It's quite a headache, but
It really is, like we said, sort of midway and at the beginning, it really is a bit of a can of worms. So I'm just conscious of the time. We have gone over by 5 minutes. So we will start to draw the session to a close. We did promise Q&A to people, and I can see some coming through on the chat now. So any that we haven't managed to get round to, we'll respond to afterwards, and everybody at the end of the webinar will be contacted as well. But we have had one question through which came through in advance, which I'd like to ask the panel. Again, if people need to drop off because of the time, that's absolutely fine. The recording will be available afterwards. So the question that we did have is with regard to the calculation of holiday pay for flexible workers. So in particular, this is hospitality event workers on a 0-hour contract, and typically who work on an ad hoc or per event basis, which can be less than 26 weeks across the calendar year. Continuing with a 0-hour contract is preferred, as to employ on a sort of gig economy arrangement isn't business efficient. So do either of you have any insight on a fair and cost-effective method to calculate holiday pay in those circumstances? And I think that's relevant to a few that have come through as well. If we could go through that question, please, guys.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and that's something that does come up quite a lot. I think what I'm hearing in that question is a concern that, you know, because an employee doesn't necessarily have a full 52 weeks paid work available to use as a basis for the calculated holiday pay at any given point, that's going to create a problem. On the face of it, that shouldn't create a problem, because as we've said, you as an employer can go back up to 52 weeks, or more than that, up to a total of 104. It's a target, it's not a requirement. So if an employee does work on average 20-25 weeks or 26 weeks in a given year, basically what you'd have to do is at each point they say they want to take leave or be paid holiday pay, establish that date, establish your reference period to start from, and then go back as to the point where you've either achieved 52 weeks or up to a maximum 104, or the total they have worked, whatever that may be, use that. So you might find across a couple of years range, across the 104 weeks, they have only worked 40 weeks out of that period. That's fine. You can use that to do the calculation. So the thing to bear in mind is that, as we've said throughout the webinar, is the key thing is to make sure you have the right data, you're recording the right figures at the right time to do that calculation. It is a requirement, to use this 52-week average, as we've said. So that is the key thing, is to make sure you've got the right data in place.
Thanks, Ian. Anything you wanted to add to that, David?
Yes, Louise. So just again, mimicking what Ian said, but again, it's all about what is stipulated in their contract. So this is something that should be reviewed, because there may be certain clauses in that contract, and it depends on whether it's a contract that spans the entire year, whether it's a permanent contract. Does that contract allow the individual to work elsewhere during that time frame? So again, it is very much dependent on the contract. And if it is very clear-cut, basically the average holiday pay ruling, which is what Ian was just discussing previously, would apply.
Thank you. Well, thank you both so much for your time. And I think sort of to round up the webinar today, this is certainly something that is complicated. It's not simple by any terms, but we really hope that today has managed to shed some light on this situation and give you some of our payroll advice there. If anybody would like to get in contact with us and you have any specific questions around your organisation, please send them through to us at info@fairwork.co.uk. phase3.co.uk, and we'll get back to you. And there is also the recording of the webinar available, which will be sent directly to your inboxes. So do feel free to catch up on that as well. And in the meantime, thank you again very much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you at one of our events again soon. Thank you very much, everybody. That's the end of the session. Take care. Goodbye.